January 30, 1968. Siu Kai Tunnels, 30 kilometers northwest of Saigon. Senior Colonel Tran Van Tra checks his watch in the dim candlelight, calculating the hours remaining before the largest coordinated offensive in the war begins. Around him, in an underground command post carved from the red clay 15 meters below the surface, officers from the Central Office for South Vietnam study maps marked with more than 100 attack targets across South Vietnam. In 12 hours, 84,000 soldiers from the People's Army of Vietnam and the National Liberation Front will strike simultaneously at cities, airbases, and military installations from the demilitarized zone to the Mekong Delta. The Americans, celebrating their Lunar New Year truce, have no idea what's coming. Tran Van Tra knows the statistics intimately. His forces will attack 5 of South Vietnam's 6 autonomous cities, 36 of 44 provincial capitals, 64 of 242 district capitals, and more than 50 hamlets. The coordination required to move tens of thousands of soldiers into position without alerting American intelligence represents 3 years of planning and preparation on a scale the revolution has never attempted. Many of these soldiers will die in the coming days. Tra accepts this reality. The question isn't whether they can hold the cities they capture, the overwhelming American firepower makes that impossible. The question is whether the offensive will achieve its strategic objective, breaking American will to continue the war. What begins at dawn will be judged a tactical defeat by military analysts for generations. Nearly 45,000 North Vietnamese and Viet Cong soldiers will die in the first month of fighting, compared to approximately 3,400 American and South Vietnamese troops. Most urban attacks will be crushed within days. The anticipated popular uprising in the South will never materialize. By conventional military metrics, the Tet Offensive will fail catastrophically. But Tran Van Tra and his commanders in Hanoi understand something about this war that American generals do not. They aren't fighting to win territory. They're fighting to win time, to erode American resolve, to make the cost of continued occupation unbearable. In this strategic calculus, the casualties they will suffer are acceptable if the offensive changes American perceptions of the war. And in ways the commanders in this tunnel cannot fully anticipate, it will succeed beyond their expectations. The path toward Tet begins not in 1968 but in 1965, when American combat troops first arrived in Vietnam in substantial numbers. The leadership in Hanoi, the Politburo members and military commanders who direct the war effort, face a strategic dilemma that has no easy solution. Their opponent possesses overwhelming technological superiority, complete air dominance, artillery that can destroy entire grid squares, and the industrial capacity to sustain operations indefinitely. Direct confrontation with American forces results in casualties the North Vietnamese can barely sustain. During the Ia Drang campaign in November 1965, the People's Army lost an estimated 1,200 to 3,000 soldiers while inflicting approximately 305 American deaths. The exchange rate favors the Americans by factors of 4 to 10. General Viet Nguyen Giap, architect of the victory over French forces at Dien Bien Phu in 1954 and Minister of Defense, understands that conventional military victory against the Americans is impossible. In classified discussions within the Politburo during 1966, Giap articulates a strategy that accepts short-term tactical defeats in exchange for long-term strategic victory. The Americans, he argues, are fighting the wrong kind of war. They measure success through body counts and territory controlled, metrics that matter in conventional warfare between nation-states. But this isn't conventional warfare. This is a revolutionary struggle where the will to continue fighting matters more than battlefield victories. The North Vietnamese strategic calculation rests on assumptions about American society that will prove remarkably accurate. First, that American public support for the war is conditional and based on perceptions of progress. Second, that American casualties, while militarily sustainable, become politically unsustainable as they accumulate without clear path to victory. Third, that American news media, operating independently of military censorship, will report the war's reality to citizens who can pressure their government to change policy. These assumptions, articulated in Politburo meetings and military planning sessions throughout 1966 and 1967, form the strategic foundation for what will become the Tet Offensive. The immediate impetus for the offensive comes from assessments of the military situation in late 1967. American and South Vietnamese forces have achieved notable successes. Operation Cedar Falls and Junction City in early 1967 disrupted communist sanctuaries near Saigon. Pacification programs are making incremental progress in some regions. American commanders project confidence that the war is being won through attrition, that enemy forces are being ground down faster than they can be replaced. General William Westmoreland, commander of U.S. forces in Vietnam, tells reporters in November 1967 that the enemy's hopes are bankrupt and that the end of the war is coming into view. In Hanoi, the leadership sees these optimistic assessments as opportunity. The greater American confidence in approaching victory, the more devastating a large-scale offensive will be to that confidence. In July 1967, the Politburo approves Resolution 13, calling for a spontaneous uprising in South Vietnamese cities, timed to coincide with military attacks that will demonstrate continued revolutionary strength. Le Duan, first secretary of the Communist Party and the most powerful figure in North Vietnam, champions the plan against skeptics who worry about the casualties such an offensive will require. The planning process reveals both the sophistication and limitations of North Vietnamese military capabilities. Coordinating attacks across the entire country requires moving large numbers of troops, weapons, and supplies through terrain under constant aerial surveillance. The Ho Chi Minh Trail, the elaborate network of roads and paths running through Laos and Cambodia, operates at maximum capacity throughout late 1967. Approximately 10,000 tons of supplies move south monthly during this period, more than double the previous year's average. American intelligence detects increased infiltration but misinterprets its purpose, assuming it indicates preparation for attacks near the demilitarized zone rather than nationwide urban operations. The deception campaign proves remarkably effective. In October 1967, North Vietnamese forces launch attacks against Loc Ninh, Song Bi, and Dak To near the Cambodian border and in the Central Highlands. These battles, which American forces view as victories due to heavy enemy casualties, serve two purposes. First, they draw American attention and forces away from urban centers toward border regions. Second, they condition American commanders to expect continued conventional engagements where superior firepower determines outcomes. When intelligence reports in January 1968 indicate enemy forces moving toward cities, many American commanders interpret this as retreat or resupply rather than attack preparation. The soldiers who will execute the Tet attacks undergo months of specialized training unlike standard guerrilla operations. Units designated for urban warfare practice house-to-house fighting, learn to operate in unfamiliar city environments, study maps and models of their specific targets. Political officers conduct intensive indoctrination, emphasizing that the offensive will spark popular uprising against the Saigon government. Many soldiers genuinely believe that South Vietnamese civilians will join them once the attacks begin, that years of revolutionary propaganda have prepared the urban population to rise against American occupation and their Vietnamese collaborators. This belief in imminent popular uprising reflects a fundamental misreading of South Vietnamese society that will contribute to the offensive's tactical failure. While the Saigon government is corrupt and unpopular with many citizens, most urban South Vietnamese have more complex attitudes toward the war than Hanoi's propaganda suggests. They fear communist rule, remember the brutal land reform campaigns in the North during the 1950s, and have accommodated to life under the current government even while resenting it. The anticipated uprising will never materialize, leaving attacking forces isolated in hostile urban terrain. The timing of the offensive exploits Tet Nguyen Dan, the Lunar New Year celebration that is Vietnam's most important holiday. Traditionally, both sides observe informal truces during Tet, allowing soldiers to return home for family celebrations. In 1968, the North Vietnamese and National Liberation Front announce a 7-day Tet ceasefire from January 27 to February 3. The South Vietnamese government and American forces agree to a 36-hour ceasefire for January 30 and 31. This agreement provides perfect cover for moving attack forces into position around target cities. South Vietnamese soldiers on leave, American troops at reduced readiness, the entire country relaxed for the holiday, conditions couldn't be more favorable for achieving surprise. The infiltration of attack forces into cities demonstrates both impressive operational security and the porousness of urban security measures. In Saigon, approximately 4,000 Viet Cong soldiers and support personnel enter the city in the days before Tet, posing as holiday travelers, hiding weapons in flour trucks and vegetable carts, staying in safe houses operated by underground networks. Similar infiltrations occur in Hue, Da Nang, Kontum, and dozens of other cities. The scale of this movement, involving tens of thousands of people and tons of weapons, occurs with minimal detection despite American and South Vietnamese intelligence efforts. The attacks begin at 0100 hours on January 31, 1968, 6 hours earlier than originally planned due to coordination confusion in some units. In Saigon, the most symbolically important target is the U.S. Embassy, a modern 6-story building that represents American power in Vietnam. A 19-man sapper team from C-10 Battalion blasts through the embassy's outer wall and fights in the embassy compound for 6 hours before being killed or captured. The team never enters the embassy building itself, but the image of communist soldiers inside the embassy grounds, broadcast on American television, delivers psychological impact far beyond the tactical significance. Simultaneously, attacks erupt at Tan Son Nhut Air Base, the Presidential Palace, South Vietnamese military headquarters, and radio stations across Saigon. The attackers achieve complete surprise but lack the numbers and heavy weapons needed to hold their objectives against American and South Vietnamese counterattacks. By dawn, U.S. military police and infantry have contained most attacks within Saigon, though fighting continues in some neighborhoods for days. The pattern repeats across South Vietnam, initial success through surprise, followed by isolation and destruction as American firepower concentrates on exposed enemy forces. The most significant tactical success occurs in Hue, Vietnam's ancient imperial capital. Approximately 10,000 North Vietnamese Army soldiers from the 4th, 5th, and 6th Regiments, supported by Viet Cong units, attack the city in overwhelming force. They capture most of Hue within hours, including the massive citadel that dominates the city center. Unlike other locations where attacks are measured in hours or days, the battle for Hue will last 26 days and require some of the most intense urban combat of the war. The attackers hold their ground because they committed sufficient forces to defend what they captured, unlike the small units sent against other cities. The fighting in Hue reveals the offensive's dual nature as both military operation and revolutionary political program. Communist forces immediately begin identifying and arresting South Vietnamese government officials, police officers, military personnel, and anyone associated with the Saigon regime. In the chaos of the battle and occupation, approximately 2,800 to 6,000 people are executed or disappear, their bodies later discovered in mass graves. This systematic elimination of opposition, which communist forces conduct during their brief control of the city, demonstrates that the offensive has both military and political objectives. The attacks aim not just to inflict casualties but to decapitate local government structures and intimidate opposition. The anticipated popular uprising, central to the offensive's political objectives, fails to materialize anywhere. South Vietnamese civilians largely shelter in their homes during the fighting, trying to survive rather than joining either side. Some provide intelligence to attacking forces, others to defenders, but the mass uprising that revolutionary planners expected never begins. This failure of political assumptions undermines the offensive's strategic concept, which depended on popular support transforming military attacks into revolutionary victory. The soldiers fighting in cities discover they are isolated, surrounded by populations that view them as invaders rather than liberators. The casualty statistics tell a story of military devastation. By the end of February 1968, approximately 45,000 communist soldiers are dead, with thousands more wounded or captured. The Viet Cong infrastructure in the south, the political and military networks built over years, is gutted. Many of the best cadre, experienced soldiers, and political officers die in the offensive. Some units lose 80% casualties. The National Liberation Front, which provides most of the forces for urban attacks, never fully recovers its strength. From Tet forward, the war becomes increasingly a conventional conflict fought by North Vietnamese regulars rather than southern insurgents. American and South Vietnamese forces lose approximately 3,400 killed during the first month of the offensive, with several thousand more wounded. These casualties, while a fraction of enemy losses, represent the heaviest American combat deaths since the Korean War. More than 14,000 South Vietnamese civilians die in the fighting, with hundreds of thousands made homeless as entire neighborhoods are destroyed by artillery and airstrikes used to dislodge entrenched enemy forces. The city of Van Tra, where American and South Vietnamese forces level much of the urban area to eliminate enemy positions, provides the famous quote attributed to an unnamed American officer, "It became necessary to destroy the town to save it." The military assessment from Hanoi following the offensive is brutal. Senior Colonel Tran Van Tra, one of the operation's principal planners, later writes that casualties exceeded even pessimistic projections. The anticipated uprising failed completely. Most military objectives were not achieved. American forces demonstrated they could respond effectively even when surprised across the entire country. By conventional military analysis, the Tet Offensive was a catastrophic defeat that set back the revolutionary cause by years. Some commanders who survived the offensive face criticism for the losses their units sustained. The recriminations within the North Vietnamese military leadership are severe. But the strategic calculation that motivated the offensive never depended primarily on military success. The objective was changing American perceptions of the war, and in this dimension, the offensive succeeds beyond what Hanoi's planners dared hope. American news coverage of the offensive, featuring images of combat in Saigon streets, the embassy attack, and the destruction in cities across South Vietnam, contradicts months of optimistic assessments from military and government officials. If the war is being won, Americans ask, how could the enemy launch such a massive offensive? If enemy forces are decimated and demoralized, how did they coordinate nationwide attacks? The gap between official pronouncements and visible reality destroys credibility. Walter Cronkite, the most trusted news anchor in America, travels to Vietnam in February 1968 to assess the situation personally. On February 27, he concludes his special report with a statement that captures shifting American attitudes. To say that we are mired in stalemate seems the only realistic, yet unsatisfactory, conclusion. President Lyndon Johnson, watching the broadcast, reportedly says, "If I've lost Cronkite, I've lost Middle America." Whether this exact quote is accurate or apocryphal, it reflects the reality that media coverage of Tet fundamentally changes the American domestic context for the war. Public opinion polling reveals the shift. In February 1968, before Tet, approximately 61% of Americans believe sending troops to Vietnam was not a mistake. By March, after the offensive, that number drops to 49%. Support for President Johnson's handling of the war falls from 40% to 26%. These numbers represent a collapse in the public consensus that has sustained American involvement. The shift isn't about supporting North Vietnamese victory. Most Americans still hope for some form of success in Vietnam. The shift is about confidence that success is achievable at acceptable cost. The political impact cascades through the 1968 election cycle. Senator Eugene McCarthy, running an anti-war campaign in the Democratic primary, nearly defeats President Johnson in New Hampshire on March 12. Senator Robert Kennedy enters the presidential race 4 days later, also opposing the war. On March 31, President Johnson announces he will not seek re-election, effectively ending his political career due to the war's unpopularity. The man who expanded American involvement in Vietnam from advisory role to major combat operations finds his presidency destroyed by the war's trajectory. In Hanoi, the leadership observes these developments with satisfaction. The offensive's military failure has produced political success beyond projections. The strategic reassessment within North Vietnamese leadership following Tet's mixed results shapes the war's remaining years. The offensive demonstrated that American forces cannot be defeated militarily in direct confrontation. The exchange rate in casualties is unsustainable if this becomes the primary mode of warfare. But the offensive also revealed American vulnerability to psychological and political pressure. Future strategy will emphasize protracted war, accepting that victory will come through erosion of American will rather than military decision. The path to victory lies in making the war too costly politically for Americans to continue, then defeating the South Vietnamese government after American withdrawal. This strategic adjustment has immediate operational consequences. Large-scale urban attacks cease after Tet. North Vietnamese forces returned to guerrilla warfare tactics, ambushes, and attacks on isolated outposts. They avoid major battles where American firepower determines outcomes. They maintain pressure sufficient to prevent South Vietnamese government consolidation but avoid casualties like those suffered during Tet. The war enters a new phase characterized by American efforts to build South Vietnamese military capability while gradually reducing American combat involvement, a process called Vietnamization. The human cost of the Tet Offensive extends beyond casualty statistics. Thousands of North Vietnamese soldiers died far from home, buried in unmarked graves or never recovered. Their families often received no notification, no remains, no certainty about their fate. The Communist Party's policy of maintaining operational security meant many families didn't learn of deaths until years later, if at all. The soldiers who survived carried physical and psychological wounds that received minimal treatment given the strained medical resources in North Vietnam. Many returned to units that had been decimated, fighting alongside replacements who lacked the training and experience of those killed during Tet. The South Vietnamese perspective on the offensive complicates the narrative of North Vietnamese strategic success. While American public opinion shifted, South Vietnamese civilians experienced the offensive as devastating betrayal of the Tet truce and proof of communist brutality. The executions in Hue, the use of civilian areas as battlefields, the destruction of homes and neighborhoods, these experiences hardened many South Vietnamese against the communist cause. The anticipated popular uprising's failure reflected not just urban-rural divisions but genuine opposition to communist rule among significant portions of the South Vietnamese population. The offensive may have convinced Americans the war was unwinnable, but it also convinced many South Vietnamese that accommodation with the North was unacceptable. The offensive's impact on the National Liberation Front, the political organization representing the Southern Revolution, proves catastrophic and permanent. The NLF provided most urban attack forces during Tet, losing a generation of leadership in the fighting. After Tet, the NLF's independent role diminishes as North Vietnamese control over southern operations increases. The promised coalition government that would include NLF representation becomes increasingly theoretical as the movement's autonomous capacity erodes. By war's end in 1975, the NLF has been effectively absorbed into the Northern Party structure, its distinct Southern revolutionary identity subordinated to Hanoi's control. General Vo Nguyen Giap's role in planning the Tet Offensive remains debated among historians. Some sources indicate Giap opposed the offensive's timing and scale, believing it premature and likely to produce unsustainable casualties. Others suggest he supported it as necessary to shift the war's trajectory. After the offensive, Giap's influence within military planning appears to diminish, with more aggressive commanders gaining prominence. His strategic preference for protracted war of attrition clashed with those who wanted decisive actions to accelerate victory. The offensive's mixed results vindicates neither approach completely, though the return to attritional strategy after Tet suggests Giap's basic strategic vision remained dominant. The long-term military consequences of the Tet Offensive shaped the war's final years. The decimation of Southern revolutionary forces means North Vietnamese regular units increasingly carry the military burden. The 1972 Easter Offensive, a major conventional invasion across the DMZ, is fought almost entirely by North Vietnamese army units with Soviet tanks and artillery. The final offensive in 1975 that captures Saigon is a conventional military campaign that bears little resemblance to the guerrilla warfare that characterized earlier years. In this sense, Tet's destruction of Southern revolutionary forces accelerates the war's transformation from insurgency to conventional interstate conflict. For American military officers, the Tet Offensive becomes a case study in the difference between tactical victory and strategic defeat. American and South Vietnamese forces won virtually every significant battle during the offensive, inflicting casualties at ratios that in conventional warfare would indicate decisive victory. Yet the offensive achieved its strategic purpose of undermining American will to continue. This paradox, winning battles while losing the war, influences American military thinking for generations. The lesson that military success doesn't guarantee strategic success if political objectives aren't achieved becomes central to professional military education. The North Vietnamese assessment of the Tet Offensive evolves over time. Immediately after, official statements claim great victory while internal assessments acknowledge devastating losses. In the 1970s, after American withdrawal, the offensive is celebrated as the turning point that broke American resolve. In recent decades, Vietnamese military historians have written more nuanced accounts that acknowledge tactical failures while maintaining that the offensive achieved strategic objectives. The debate reflects broader questions about how revolutionary movements should weigh tactical military considerations against strategic political objectives. The offensive's impact on negotiations proves complex. Peace talks begin in Paris in May 1968, but substantive negotiations stall for years over fundamental disagreements. The North Vietnamese demand complete American withdrawal and formation of a coalition government including the NLF. The United States and South Vietnamese government reject any solution that doesn't guarantee South Vietnam's continued independence. The offensive strengthens North Vietnamese negotiating position by demonstrating their capacity for sustained warfare, but it also hardens American resolve to ensure that such catastrophic losses produce meaningful political results. The negotiations drag on for 5 years, outlasting the Johnson administration and continuing through most of the Nixon presidency. By 1973, when the Paris Peace Accords finally end American involvement, the settlement reflects neither side's maximum objectives. The United States withdraws without achieving a stable non-communist South Vietnam. North Vietnamese forces remain in South Vietnam but don't immediately overthrow the Saigon government. The accords create conditions for continued conflict, which erupts immediately after American withdrawal and culminates in North Vietnamese victory in April 1975. From Hanoi's perspective, the long arc from Tet in 1968 to victory in 1975 validates the strategic calculation that American will could be broken even if American forces couldn't be defeated. The Tet Offensive establishes patterns visible in subsequent conflicts. The disparity between military success and strategic victory, the importance of public opinion in democratic nations fighting extended wars, the limitations of firepower without political solutions, these lessons resonate through American military involvement in Iraq, Afghanistan, and beyond. For revolutionary movements worldwide, Tet becomes a case study in how politically motivated forces can achieve strategic objectives despite tactical defeats, provided they maintain will to continue fighting and exploit their opponent's political vulnerabilities. The soldiers who fought in the Tet Offensive, both those who died and those who survived, became symbols manipulated by all sides. North Vietnamese propaganda portrayed them as heroes who struck a blow against American imperialism. American officials emphasized their deaths as evidence of enemy desperation and military failure. South Vietnamese government described them as terrorists who violated the Tet truce and murdered civilians. The reality remains more complex than any propaganda allowed. They were soldiers fighting for what they believed was national liberation, operating under strategic assumptions that proved partially false, achieving objectives their commanders hadn't anticipated through sacrifices that exceeded planning projections. The casualty statistics from the Tet Offensive represent more than military abstracts. Each of the 45,000 communist soldiers who died was an individual with family, history, hopes. Many were conscripted, others volunteered. Some believed deeply in the revolutionary cause, others fought because they had no choice. Their deaths purchased strategic success but at costs that reverberated through North Vietnamese society for generations. The missing soldiers, those whose remains were never recovered or identified, created family grief that extended for decades. The Vietnamese cultural practice of ancestor veneration makes unrecovered remains particularly painful, denying families the closure that proper burial provides. The offensive's impact on South Vietnamese civilians, often overlooked in analyses focused on military outcomes, created humanitarian catastrophe that shapes Vietnam still today. The approximately 14,000 civilian deaths during the offensive were only the beginning. Hundreds of thousands became refugees, fleeing destroyed neighborhoods for camps around major cities. The social disruption, family separations, economic devastation, these effects persisted long after fighting ended. Many South Vietnamese who supported neither side found their lives destroyed by military operations they couldn't control, fighting for causes in which they had no voice. January 30, 1968. Senior Colonel Tran Van Tra emerges from the Cu Kai tunnels into tropical darkness, hours before the offensive begins. He knows many of the soldiers now moving into attack positions will die in the coming days. He knows the anticipated popular uprising probably won't materialize as political officers promise. He knows American firepower will exact terrible casualties from exposed forces in urban terrain. What he cannot know is whether the offensive will break American political will to continue the war, whether the sacrifices his soldiers will make will advance the revolution toward victory or merely add to an already horrific casualty toll. In the years ahead, historians will debate whether the Tet Offensive succeeded or failed, whether it was military disaster or strategic masterstroke. But in this moment before dawn, Tra understands only that the revolution has committed itself to a gamble that will be decided not on Vietnamese battlefields but in American living rooms, not by military victory but by political exhaustion. The soldiers moving through darkness toward their objectives carry with them the hopes of a revolution that has already lasted a generation and may last another. They will fight with courage their enemies acknowledge even while killing them. And their sacrifice, measured by body counts that shock even hardened commanders, will purchase something more valuable than military victory. It will purchase doubt, the creeping American uncertainty that this war can be won at acceptable cost. In the brutal mathematics of revolutionary warfare, that doubt will prove more powerful than any battlefield triumph, transforming tactical defeat into the strategic victory that brings them, 7 years later, to Saigon's gates.